Well, hello, everybody. I'm Tim Mangan, Team Emerging Technologies, those of you who don't know me. The rest of the company is also sitting here in the front row, Mary Jane, so you can always say hi to her. She's the one that's easier to talk to. So, all right, so we're going to talk a little bit about MSIX, and I want to talk about a few other things around that whole packaging space as well. But I actually want to start with something that started out a conversation online a number of weeks back, where we started talking about end-user computing. And by the way, I want to be perfectly clear about this. This is an AI-generated image. Okay, so I use Dolly for it. So I think it's good that we let people know when that happens. And this was, I asked end-user computing. That's the image they got me. I don't know where they got that from. But so end-user computing. Most of you familiar with it, right? Okay. We were having an online discussion about it, and we said, well, how do you define end-user computing? And there were a number of people in that discussion who were absolute experts in their area, and every one of them had a completely different answer that was related to their particular specialty within our space. And so I want to kind of talk to that a little bit, because I think that it is very likely that I can make the case that every single person in this room is in the end-user computing space. So I go back in that kind of space back to 2000 when I was at Softricity, and we created the concept of our application virtualization. Sorry, I have a cold. And in those days, when we wanted to create these systems to deploy these applications, it was largely Citrix, right? And so you had to first install the OS server, and then you had to install what was then called the terminal services stack, which is now the equivalent of the RDS role that you put on. And then you drop Citrix on top of that. And at that point, we had our first real community that would be considered to be in this space, which is a thing called the ThinNet. Now, ThinNet was a mailing list run by a guy by the name of Jim Kenzik, who was the IT director for the Cayuga County Public Libraries in Cleveland, Ohio. And he was great at pulling in a whole bunch of folks who were at various companies and deploying these things and getting them to talk to each other and share information. He was very good at that. And in the Thin List, what was ended up being created is a set of lists that people kind of gathered tips on how to do server performance for that environment. Because the server was not created for multiple users. And we were doing all of these things and trying to pack a lot of users on them, and we were really stretching the performance of these servers out sorry, quite a bit. So what we had were these lists, and you'd have like 120 things that you should tweak after building that server. So the whole process was really hard in those days. And one of those great things with technology is that as things are new, they're really hard, and over time, it just gets easier to do those things, which leaves us more time to worry about the new hard stuff to work on, right? But that's sort of what's happened here. But when you looked at that list, if you asked any of these top-level experts to go through that list, line by line by line, and tell me, what does this do? What does this do? Why would I do this? Any one of them probably knew less than, 50% of what those things were. They were just things that someone had come up with at one point, they tweaked their system, they thought it helped, and it ended up getting added into the list. So in 2003, I created a concept to look at performance a little bit differently for this environment. Now, I had left Softricity. I had my own product that I was doing that was actually trying to help the performance in that environment. And I created a concept that I released in a white paper in Darmstadt, Germany, the old Breiform conferences. And it was called Perceived Performance. And the idea behind that is exactly what you think of when you hear of perceived end-user performance. I just didn't throw those other words in there. But the idea there was that, hey, we've got these systems. It's not just that server operating system. We've also got a network, and we've got end-user equipment. And rather than focusing on the performance at the server, we should be looking at how does this performance feel to that end user. and doing measurements from that point. As they take actions, how long does it take for things to get back? Primarily, I was looking at latency as well as jitter. If you do the same thing over and over again, does it vary over time? So if you think about things like audio and video, that was really important at that point because we didn't have quite as good of the buffering technology involved with it. Okay. So later on, there was another group of my friends here from the Netherlands. One was Ruben Sprout from PQR and Jeroen van de Kamp from Login Consultants, and they formed together and created a community thing that later became LSI. Okay, so it was originally just a separate side project that they were doing as a way to measure server performance, but using that same technique. Let's start at the edge of it, let's run some workloads, and let's see how many users we can get on a certain server. And in both of these cases, the whole idea was you do something like that, and then you make changes to some of the stuff in there, and you measure again. And that's how you know whether or not you're improving performance or not. So that was the big difference there. Later, we saw folks like Benny Trich and, again, Ruben and Sean Bass, who used to be there at VMware, and they did all of their graphics testing, where you look at different graphics protocols, and if it was GDI-based or OpenGL-based, and you use the RDP stack for your protocol, or you use the Citrix HDS stacks, or you use the VMware, whatever the Teradata one was called, I don't even remember. But you look at these different things, and how does that affect performance? And that's really what became that end-user computing space. And it was really kind of the thing that actually created the term end user was the fact that we were originally doing just these RDS servers, and then VDI came along, and we had to try to figure out how to distinguish between them. And so we started calling it server-based computing and VDI. And as terms of the challenges, they're really the same across those spaces. So we started talking about end-user computing as sort of being the combination of those. And I think where we are today is really, it's all of those things. And my definition for end-user computing is this. It's about taking the promise and capabilities that are there of the PC, Windows, and Windows ecosystem, and making that available, maintainable, and secure for the enterprise, allowing them to take advantage of that. Not necessarily in the way it was originally designed for, but to be able to do that within their own organization. And that's what end-user computing is about. It's about making all of that stuff happen. If I didn't mention the word secure in there, I was supposed to. All right, because that's always part of the issue as well. All right, so I'm the app guy. I deal with apps all the time. We have a lot of different ways to get these applications out onto operating systems. We can deploy them natively, whether it's inside the image or deploying them after with something like Config Manager or Intune. AppV, of course, has been very, very popular, particularly in that terminal server world with Citrix. But also, a lot of times deploying out to physical desktops as well when the company had both of those things in play. Citrix app layering and VMware app volumes are another opportunities that are out there. There are some other players. Liquidware is here at the show with Flex Apps. Numescent, not here at the show, but I saw Rory, so you can talk to him about what they do. And those are options as well. But we got MSIX, and that's the new kid in town, and that's what I'm really here to talk about today. If you haven't gotten the message, AppV is going away. I wish I could give you an exact date. Okay, the date I can give you is April 2026, 2.5 years from now. Okay, and we believe Microsoft is going to stick to their guns on that date and not change it again. I don't know. Ask the Microsoft guy. All right, so let's talk about MSIX because we do need to start getting there. But it's not necessarily the only option. Now, one of the other things I want to talk about is what's happening in really kind of the security world that really is going to affect those of you who are building these desktops and these applications. And that's that the apps are built on some standard components. And those standard components are starting to become more of a problem for us. Right? So we have, the old Win32 libraries and other libraries from other folks. I don't know how many people follow Rory Monahan He has a podcast called 5 Bytes. And this week, he talked about a new CVE that Google has. And this is a Google API that developers often bring into their code. And great, so we got this CVE, we better patch this thing. But guess what? We have no idea what applications it's in, right? Developers, not even Google knows. Developers just go and say, oh yeah, I like this, and they put it in their thing, and they package it up in their MSI, and they deliver it, and it gets installed on your system in the private directory with that app, and you have no idea that that CVE is there, and you probably don't have a great way to figure it out yet, right? And that's part of the problem here. We also have the .NET frameworks, and we may have other dependencies that are involved in here. But this is what's happening, is that the life cycle has been shortening. So if you talk about the old VC runtimes, right? Those are running now at somewhere around 30 to 35 years of a lifespan, and it's still continuing. Microsoft every month is giving us new security fixes for those in our Windows updates, right? And that's probably going to continue for a long time because, quite frankly, I don't think they can get off of it. .NET framework. Those have defined lifetimes that are about 15 years. So if you are using things that are built with 4.6 and below, 4.6.1 maybe, it is already out of life support. 4.7, I think it's like November, I can't remember, this year or next year. But these all have defined life dates and they're coming out. And that means that if you continue to use those, if you do what enterprises have done for so long of install and forget until somebody bangs me that I have to do something with it, you're going to have these vulnerabilities in your systems. So you're going to have to start thinking about these things more often. The new stuff, all the .NET, used to be called .NET Core, now it's .NET 5, 6, 7, 8's coming out this fall. Maybe it has already, I don't know. It's pretty close. Those have lifespans that run between 3 and 5 years. So if you're looking at like .NET 5, that's already out of support. .NET 6, you're good right now. .NET 7, I believe, goes out of support because that was a 3-year one. That goes out of support this November. So the apps that are built on that are already going to be out of support. So you're going to have to be touching these applications more often. So if I look at a standard enterprise, and I take a look at the way that they treat applications today, a larger enterprise, and we talk about, what's your application portfolio? Oh, we have 500, 3,000 apps, whatever the number is. If we look at how many they touch during a year, it tends to be about 10% because it's install and forget. That's going to have to change. All of this stuff, the security problems that are coming into play, means you're going to have to be touching these applications more often. I don't know if that's going to be 50% or 70%. By the way, this was AI's attempt at saying 70% is the new 10%. I don't get it, but okay. I love his hair, though. But you're going to have to be touching these things more often. You're going to have to start developing policies that allow you to do that because you're not going to double and triple your packaging staff. So you're going to have to get smarter at this. And I think there are a number of vendors in this space that are working on things to make the work easier, start thinking about the full application life cycle and give you tooling to help take you through that. And you're going to need to be looking at that more. Okay, so let's get into MSIX. Why are we doing it? Right? If you're at the master installer session, they said, hey, you should start with why. Fortunately, I started with why. I was lucky. Right? These are the things Microsoft talks about. It's clean, install, uninstall, right? Doesn't provide rot to your systems. Your operating systems will end up being more stable in the long run. If you were used to AppV, I always talked about AppV as being something that is there to protect the application. I create that AppV package, I can drop that on any OS in my environment, and I just know it's going to work, and dropping it in isn't going to break anything. MSIX isn't all that different, except the focus is on protecting the operating system, not protecting the application. But it's very similar in that stance. It's also a little bit more secure, okay? We tend not to talk about that as much, but the fact that you're running these things in an isolated environment means that the entry points to get you having bad things happening are more difficult. the odds of something bad happening and getting outside of that container are probably not terribly minimized, but it will stop some stuff automatically just by chance. So you are a little bit more secure by running these applications in containers. And quite frankly, with the way our industry is going, I think we have to be doing more and more to try to get to that standpoint. If you look at what Microsoft did with LSAS and doing the shielded VM thing within your operating system as a way to protect the credentials, we're going to have to start to get eventually to a point where we're thinking about that for every single application. Thank goodness we're not there yet, but eventually that may well end up having to occur because it's getting harder and harder, and the bad folks are getting better and better at it. All right, so each year I release what I call the MSIX report card. That's available from my website at www.tmergent.com. And in that, I take a look at kind of where we are with MSIX. I do this generally at around the end of January every year. So the numbers you're going to see here are from last January. Part of that is some testing that I do to look at application compatibility. Now, when I talk about application compatibility, lots of people talk about the AppCompat. And I often see a lot of vendors that consider AppCompat to be this right here, right? I take the application, I launch it, hey, there's no errors, it's good, right? That's not what I talk about. When I say something is compatible, I'm saying basically, if you had the native installation and you packaged it up in this package, would an end user notice the difference if they got that package instead? If the answer is no, then it's not compatible. So we're talking about pre-config. The enterprise wants to pre-configure things like getting rid of the auto updater and things like that. Does that actually work when it gets to the device? Stickiness. That means that now when the end user makes some changes in their configuration, you shut down the app, you open it up, does it still work? Because sometimes that doesn't work. Is the main functionality there? Can I do what that app intended to do? And then there's all the extra stuff that may or may not be terribly important, right? The file associations, the shell extensions. It may depend on A, your organization, and B, the application. So those are sort of subjective things that I can't say particularly, is this app good or not? But if I see anything like that, I say it's not compatible. It may fall into that subjective category where you might find it compatible and you might not. So these are the numbers from year one, 2018, when Microsoft released MSIX at the end of 2017. I did my first round of this testing. And I was using the Microsoft MSIX packaging tool. And at that point, the PSF existed, but it really wasn't usable for IT. It was source code up on GitHub, and if you felt like downloading it and building your own version of it and adding the files in and figuring out how to do that, you could, but nobody was going to do that. And the results, as you can see here, were not terribly wonderful, right? So that was about 22% for that fully compatible state. A lot of stuff fell into the subjective state, which wasn't bad, but there's an awful lot of red there, which meant there was really no way to deploy that application. So where were we in January of last year? Okay, so this is, again, the exact same test, the Microsoft packaging tool, and where they've gone. They've gone to about 33%. Got rid of a lot of the red, though, which is good, right? A lot of stuff in the subjective. You know, they've made improvements. And quite frankly, Microsoft, over time, has been making a lot of improvements, a lot of which you can't see here, right? When Microsoft wants to improve MSIX, they first create some schema extensions that describe what this thing is. They then have to implement changes inside the operating system to support things. They have to update the desktop app installer program to be able to take things from the manifest and put them into the system in a way that you'll actually get that functionality. And then eventually, hopefully, they eventually start incorporating that stuff into the Microsoft MSIX packaging tool. And quite frankly, that last step is usually really late. Okay, but they got time because of that second piece. They're implementing it in the OS, and you've got to get your endpoints onto that OS, right? So we got some features right now that only work on Windows 11 and not Windows 10. How many of you are on Windows 11 right now? Okay, let me ask the question differently. How many of you are not on Windows 10 only at this point? Now, that's not the question I want to ask. How many of you are on Windows 11 only at this point? That's the question I want to ask. one hand, okay? All right, and so that's the problem. You need to be able to support these things with the OSs you have in play today. But that's going to change over time, so you'll start getting that functionality. All right, so what happens when we start bringing in the package support framework? So these are the numbers that came from last January using the Microsoft packaging tool and then following that up with my TMEditX tool. So I have two different tools available. One, PSF tooling, and that's free, and you use that in the middle of your MSIX processing. And another one is TMEditX, which is a post-process thing. So this is where I get the best compatibility. I don't have hard numbers for the PSF tooling on that, but if I had to guess, rather than the 75% green, you'd probably see somewhere between 60 and 65% green. Okay. Now the comparison, which is tests that I do and are in the report, is I also package those up in AppV and do that testing, and that number is at 97% for these same apps. So how do we do that? We have these two approaches. One is we use the Microsoft MSIX packaging tool, right? And so if you were in the, did we see a packaging today in the Microsoft demo? We did see a packaging. Okay, yeah. So you're going to install the app. You're going to add your pre-configuration in there while it's monitoring, and then you're going to save that package off. And you might be able to do some other things. They've integrated some stuff that you can bring into PSF, but quite frankly, that's their branch of the PSF, so it's not quite as good. I have my own branch, which is probably 2 years of development newer than what's in their code right now. But you know, it's a start to do it that way. But what I do instead is I use PSF tooling in the middle of that process while it's still monitoring. PSF tooling will look at all of the changes made by the application, understanding what it intended to get in terms of the integrations, knowing what the packaging tool is going to do, and it makes modifications, bringing in the PSF as necessary, changing the shortcut out to go to the launcher instead of the main application, all of those things. And then let the packaging tool create that package off. So this was the original way that we were doing it. I said with this right now, that's where you get about that 60 to 65%. Over the past couple of years, I've made this tool easier. It still looks really complicated as you look at it, but I've at least made it so that the instructions are hit button 1, hit button 2, hit button 3, hit button 4. That's going to get you most of those applications. There are going to be some that you're going to have to do special things to because they're just a little bit different. And for that, I want to mention, we did create, and Mary Jane has a few copies of this simplified packaging for MSIX brochure here. And that just shows you how you would do that. I was working with a company recently, and they're using an offshore packaging farm in India. And they wanted this. They're actually the ones that got me to create this because they wanted to be able to hand them a piece of paper that looks like a script because that's what those people can do really well. You give them a script, do this, do this, do this, do this. They can do the job. If there has to be a lot of real troubleshooting and stuff like that, they're just not going to do it. You're going to need a more experienced packager to do that work. So that's the one approach. The second, I mentioned already, this is where I got those numbers from. So we use the Microsoft packaging tool, and we don't care what it does. We just go click, 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 and just get a package as quick as we can. We can automate that with scripting and stuff as well. And then we run TMEditX afterwards. And TMEditX is going to analyze what's in that package, understanding, again, what the intent of the installer was by looking at what it tried to do in a native installation, and then translating that into all of the things that we need in MSIX. And so we'll apply the PSF, the same thing PSF tooling is doing, but rather than in that analysis considering, well, what do I do to trick the Microsoft tool to save this off in the right form, there are limits in there. Here, I have the ability to just generate the full MSIX with all of the capabilities of all of the newer extensions that Microsoft has added in that aren't necessarily being pulled out when you go through the packaging tool today. And so we'll do that. We'll also do package cleanup with this app as well quite often because it's easier to do it. The Microsoft packaging tool, you're doing it on a machine you revert all the time. It's hard to keep a up-to-date list of what to exclude from the packaging. So here, we'll just do it as a cleanup operation because this is a tool you would usually run on the test system. You package it up, you go to the test system, run through this thing, and if you need, then you can fix it up. And there's a whole bunch of additional fixes that I can't do in PSF tooling that we can apply and then save that new version of the package off. Okay. So those are the two approaches that we take. Do I need to click about? No, I don't. Good. So this is a video just walking you through that process with the packaging tool and PSF tooling, so you can get a view of it. So we start up the Microsoft MSIX packaging tool. We'll put in our information that we need to do here. So I'll have my package name. It's in here. So I'm going to do WinZip. Right? Very common application that we all know. Doesn't work terribly well with MSIX, but we'll do the best we can with it. I want to put in the version, and yeah, unfortunately, I left this in the video. I had to go look up what version it was I was packaging up, so give me a second here. And I'm going to my automated installer directory, because everything I package, I do with a custom PowerShell script. So I have my own PowerShell module called Passive Install that you can also download off of my website that I use. We'll see an example of that here a little later on. But that does the full silent installation and any other customization I want to do to each of those apps. And so when I want to package, I do that. And quite frankly, this turns out to be a better way to do packaging. Years back, we would package something up and we would write some notes. In AppV, we called it a recipe. Right? Here are the things that I do when I package up this application. And quite frankly, none of us are very good at doing those notes. And so by doing it in scripting, you actually get better accuracy in your notes. So this is an example of the script. I've got this commandlet called install passive file. And with that, I can pass it any type of file, an exe, an MSI, a reg file, a CB script, a PowerShell script. Just give it the file name, and it knows the syntax to run that thing, and you just add any extra arguments. So I'll just go ahead and run that, and we'll do the install of WinZip. We'll do a little bit of customization to it. I always do these with the passive option rather than the silent option because there is no end user here, and I like to see progress. Okay, and that's done. I've optimized the end-gen queues, which is something I always like to do in my packages. And then at this point, rather than move to the next step with the packaging tool, we're going to launch PSF tooling. So this is the PSF tooling. And you start with just hitting button number 1, suggest the fix-ups. So it does that analysis and it figures out what it thinks you need to know. The only one it can't analyze is the need for the registry fix-up, because that's a runtime thing, and this is just a static analysis looking at what's here. So we found out that there were duplicate shortcuts, and the MSIX packaging tool will strip that down to 1 because 1 had command line arguments, so I wanted to fix that up. And there's a bunch of file problems. Some of it that the application would not see all of those files. Where it says visibility, the application would not see those files in the package without one of the file type fix-ups, even though they're in there. And then the others, it's finding XML, in this case, files that it thinks the application might want to write to based on the file extension, and therefore we need a fix-up for that. So we're just going to use the MFR fix-up. And anytime I do fix-ups to the application, I automatically add the reg legacy fix-up because it's likely to solve a problem and it's not likely to cause one. All right, so then we hit the determine new components, and we can then see details of what we do. This is how it would actually change those shortcuts, for example, from the main application to a copy of PSF Launcher, which has been put into the package. Then we hit button number 3, which is to, okay, tell me exactly what you would do to the package. At this point, the tool hasn't changed anything on the system, right? But this is going to tell us, here are the exact changes I will make to implement what you told me to do here. And this list will come up in just a second. There's one more thing on this one. So I'm using new MFR fix-up. And I'll talk about why I'm doing this later, but it's going to work in the installed location virtualization mode. One thing the packaging tool will not do is take care of this part for me. And so I've given you some text, and you just hit that check button, copy to clipboard. It'll put it in the clipboard. Later, when we get into the package editor, we're going to export the manifest and add that stuff in so that we get installed location virtualization into the package. Okay, but these are all the changes that it has to do. It has to change shortcuts, it has to drop files down, it has to inject an icon so that we get the right icon for our package and our shortcuts. And then once those changes have been injected. Everything should be green there. That's good. We can just close the tool, return back to the packaging tool, and complete the packaging process. This is a good spot for the video because I can go do this. Okay, so we went in there, we went and looked in the manifest, we added that install location virtualization piece into it. Oh, okay, that's what we're going to do here. So open the file, bring in the manifest. I always just scroll down to the end of the applications element and just hit a return and paste into there. And that's the stuff that I actually need. There is a potential for, I must have one of those here. Yeah, that thing right here I'm about to swipe. I might need to add that at the top of the file. It turns out in this package I don't have to. But this is the schema extension that gets you installed location virtualization. So this is a feature that should be on all of your currently deployed operating systems today. So it's great to add this into the package. But I might have add the reference at the top. But I already have UAP, yeah, it was UAP 10. Yeah, UAP 10 was already in this package for other reasons, so I don't have to copy that piece up at the top. All right, so that was good. I saved the file off. Packaging tool read back in. There were no errors, which is good. And now we can save that package off. So that's the process that we use using the free path here. So as I said, this will get you that 60, 65% level of compatibility. Now, there's nothing I'm doing in TM-EditX that you couldn't, in the package editor here, actually do yourself. Right? A lot of that stuff is moving files around. It's adding a lot of stuff into the AppX manifest file that you'd have to type in. So it's kind of harder to do it through this path, but technically, yeah, you could get there. Oops. No, I don't want to run that video again. I really don't. How about that button? Okay, cool. Okay, so how do we get this the 75%? Well, let's go to a VM here. Oh, right, I'm sorry. I don't have internet, I can't do that demo. My code signing's not working because it needs the internet. That's one of the weird things that's happening, by the way. So the certificate authorities have realized that they have a little bit of problem with the certificates that people are deploying, and that companies are occasionally losing control over their certificate and then have to do a revocation for the ones being used for code signing. And so as a response to that, what they're doing is trying to move to a way that those certificates are only stored in a very secure way through hierarchical storage, more or less. And so that's where we see Microsoft has a new thing called Azure Code Signing. This is different than whatever the name was previously that was close to that, right? And I think it had something with Defender in it. And the idea is that the certificate itself stays in that secure storage. And when you want to go sign, you're passing up basically the hash of your stuff, and it's generating what you need, and then you would use the sign tool to inject it in. And so DigiCert this last year, for example, have done something similar. They call it Key Locker. So as I had to upgrade my certificate this summer for my tooling, I had to go to Key Locker. And so now I need to use that as a method to do it. To do that, I need internet access, and I don't have it here. Basically, it's that same type of process. So they have a secure storage location in there. I've got some secrets that I have to send to be able to do my signing, but in the end, it actually does it through Sign Tool. So as we see in my TM-EditX tool, I now support the local certificates as well as the DigiCert stuff. I'm looking forward to integrating also in the Azure Code Signing method, because I know some customers have been using the older one, so they'll want to go there. But I don't quite have all the APIs I need yet, so I don't have that one available. All right, how are we doing on time? Oh, I'm doing okay. particularly since I'm skipping that last demo. So with TM@X, which I'm sorry, I wish I could have shown you, but there is a demo I recently did with Remo 3 that's out there, and actually go through that process there. But basically, what we would end up doing is we'd start up TM@X, it would go through an analysis, it would make the recommendations for the PSF, we could alter those things, but then it would be a whole slew of recommended fixes and additional fixes. And the recommended fixes, generally as the quick version of how do I use that tool, is you say, yeah, if it tells me to add the PSF, I add it in. If it has recommended fixes, I just take them. And that's going to get me pretty far along. Out of the 75%, that would probably get me to about 72% with just that. I do have these available fixes, and those are things that I wouldn't normally use, but if things aren't quite working, I might go back to. To give an example, the application GIMP. How many people have had to deploy GIMP? Okay, number of hands here. All right, GIMP has a real problem with MSIX. It has to do with the way it's got a ton of sub-processes, and the way it launches them is really weird. And even with the package support framework, you will end up with DLL not founds, because it's using an interface that the dynamic library fix-up doesn't know how to trap that interface. And I wrote that thing. I don't know how to trap that interface yet. It's really weird the way they're coming in. So as instead, I've got an alternate way to do it. And that would be to take the DLLs in the package and just copy them all into the system, VFS System 32 and VFS x64 folders. If I put them there, they always get found. And it just solves it for this. So I would do that instead of the dynamic library fix-up, which this tool probably would have told me I probably want. So that's where sometimes they have to do that little bit of extra work. It's going to require some debugging on your part, right? And going back and saying, okay, let me try this and see if it works. But that's how we get to that 75 to 80% range, depending on how much of the subjective stuff you want to take. MSIX AppAttach. Okay, a really important thing, particularly for those who are like thinking about AVD or Citrix customers who are now trying to move to it, and they're using not necessarily the MSIX AppAttach stuff in the cloud to deploy the applications, but they're using that approach of the AppAttach and building it into their console, so you have one place to go to. And they've done a pretty good job with it. It actually works a lot the way their secondary integration with AppV works, where you just specify the packages, you specify the groups that you want to deploy it to, and it just takes care of it for you. When the user logs in, boom, that thing will show up as quickly as possible. Now, when we did that with AppV, and this is some very old testing, by the way, I'm sure the numbers will be different today. I measured a bunch of applications like that, and it takes AppV about 1.8 seconds per package to go through that. So the user logs in, if they got 5 packages, that's about 10 seconds, and all their applications are there. Right? Now this is in the mode where it's not really streaming all the packages down right away, which is how it can do it that fast. But if I had an MSI and I was doing those same packages, we'd be looking at how long does it take to do an MSI install, even silently installed, right? 30 seconds a piece, probably. Some applications, much more than that. MSIX, if I took the MSIX packages and I just ran PowerShell script to install all of those things right away, that would take an average of a little under 19 seconds per package. AppAttach came in at about 2.4 seconds, so it was more than AppV. Again, this was the first version of AppAttach. I have not gone back to look at this further. There was a lot of room for improvement. As I look at what AppV actually has to do in terms of integration, when you say to go do that install, and when I look at what AppAttach has to do, AppAttach has less things to do because it's ignoring a lot of stuff. So it should have been faster. So I know there was room for improvement. I just don't know how much they've done to improve that. But still, it's in the range that it's acceptable. If I was using that for a non-persistent VDI and every day I logged in, if instead of waiting 10 seconds, I had to wait 15 seconds before all the apps were there, not a terribly big deal. Conversion from AppV to MSIX. So I looked at this a number of years ago and concluded that it probably wasn't worth converting. Okay, so Microsoft added some conversion support in the packaging tool, and the end results weren't really very good. I was seeing, so to begin with, we knew that only like at that point, 30% of the applications even had a chance of working, because this was early on. But even with that, I was seeing about 5% that I could get through that process. And it just seemed ridiculous to even bother to try. And that's what I was telling customers. But this year, with a more hard date and a realization that I now have better tooling capabilities, because one of the problems with the process was that there was no way for me to do PSF tooling in that process. It was just a straight conversion. There was no runtime monitoring. I couldn't affect it. And TM-EditX didn't exist in those days. And when I started hearing from customers, well, what I'm going to do, I started thinking about it. I said, hey, wait a minute. I've got TM-EditX now. I can just let them do the conversion and try to do a better job. I still have all the information in that package about what the application wanted to do when it installed, how it was trying to integrate with the operating system and the end user. And I can take advantage of that and make a package that would be better. So I went through that process. In doing that, I found out there were a few things that I could do better in the tool, because those packages look different than the native install. You know, we've been through the AppV sequencer, and it did things a little bit differently, and then the converter. So I did make a few fixes in there, but this is a completely automatable process. So I took the same 80 applications that I run in my compatibility test, and I hit a button, and that remoted out and automated all of the installations, okay, for the MSIX packaging tool. I went out and played a round of golf, came back, had lunch, came back, did some other stuff, but basically about 8 hours later, I had my 80 packages created that way. I then run through a second script. Everything that's in TM-EditX is also scriptable, so I had a command line there, and it just went through all 80 packages and fixed them all up. So over the course of a single day, I had my 80 packages ready to go for testing. And that's pretty easy. So if you've got a big set of applications, you can run through something like this, and now it's really a testing exercise. Do those applications work? And then if they don't work, what do I do about it? So what did I get out of this? I got about 60%. All right. Now, I did not have any AppV packages with scripts, because that's not going to, you're going to have to manually deal with anything with a script. But for those other packages, I got about 60% straight out of the box. And now I can take the other, since I know I can get to 75 to 80%, I can now do a full packaging with those others and test. And then I'm still going to have 25, maybe 30% of the apps that I still can't get to work. And I'm going to have to deploy those another way. Last thing I want to bring into your idea here is automated testing. So when I talked earlier about that shrinking time span, and you're going to have to deal with applications more often, you got to look at the whole life cycle. This is one that I think is becoming very ripe. And so there's some companies out there, Remo3, Liquid, and whatever their new name is now, I can never remember, and some others. I actually went through Power Automate, because when I do all of that testing, it takes me about 2 weeks to do the testing for just one of those package types, right? I test an AppV, I test MSIX without the packaging tool, test it with the fixed up packages, and each of those would take 3 weeks for me to test. I had great notes, but I went and looked at Power Automate from Microsoft. So you can get that, brought it down. And over the course of 3 weeks, I wrote my framework, and I wrote all of my tests for all 80 apps and tested them. And so this stuff has gotten a lot easier than it used to be years ago. I don't know if you remember like AutoIt or what was the thing called? LoadRunner, Mercury LoadRunner, I remember from my past. They were nice, but they were very, very clunky. I had to learn a lot of lessons and learn how to do it well. I also had all of that great information about how I was going to test all of those applications already written, because I had notes about how I do that. But still, I mean, 3 weeks, that's pretty impressive to be able to do that. This is the sort of stuff that you eventually need to start looking at so that you can automate this whole process. Boom, package it up, with the customized install script you already have. When you get that update, create the package, do that first level of tests with this, and that's the direction you're going to need to go. There's still going to have to be a lot of hand-holding along the way, but I think that's where eventually you have to get to. You can't do it all at once. I'd start with that automated scripting first, go to the automating packaging second, This is sort of the third thing. That doesn't mean do all of the apps that way, though. Start with the ones that you're constantly already touching, right? Those Adobe apps or whatever you have to touch every month, or in-house package. Those are the things that we need to look at. So, all right. That's my spiel. I'm Tim Mangan. I'm going to be here at the conference. Feel free to reach out to us. Also, if you do have any packagers, I'll just remind you of this book I wrote a long time ago called the Application Book, which is sort of the packager's Bible that really explains when the installer puts everything down, what is it putting down there, why is it there, what does it do, how can you tweak that to get a better application, like if you don't like the file association becoming the default, or you want it to become the default. What do I actually touch in that customization to make that happen? Thank you.